The last train of the night always felt different, but on that rainy Thursday evening, Ethan felt it the moment he stepped into the nearly empty Red Line station, where the fluorescent lights above flickered in long, sickly pulses, and the sound of wind echoed through the underground tunnels like a distant voice calling from somewhere it shouldn't. He had missed the second-to-last train by barely a minute, so now he stood alone on the platform, looking down the dark tunnel, while dripping water from his umbrella pattered softly onto the concrete, and the whole station seemed to stretch into an unnatural quietness, as if the city above had stopped breathing. A single old man sat on a bench farther down the platform, hunched forward, wearing a dirty long coat that touched the floor, and he never looked up, not even when Ethan cleared his throat, or walked a little closer to make sure he wasn't hurt. His hands were folded tightly together, trembling slightly, and Ethan thought maybe the man was just cold or unwell, but there was something about the way he kept his head bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear, that made Ethan step back slowly. The digital clock above the tracks glitched between wrong times, flashing numbers that didn't make sense, and the arrival screen flickered between train approaching and no service, creating a strange sense of uncertainty that made Ethan check his phone for confirmation, only to find he suddenly had no signal at all, even though the station normally had perfect reception. Then he heard it, soft at first, barely noticeable. The faint squealing of metal wheels far down the tunnel, slowly growing louder, echoing through the underground until the vibrations traveled through the floor beneath his shoes. The old man finally moved, but instead of turning toward the sound, he lifted his head and stared directly at Ethan, revealing glassy, terrified eyes as he whispered, "Don't get on the train." Ethan froze. The old man's voice was raspy but desperate, and his expression held a kind of fear that didn't look theatrical or confused. It looked like the fear of someone who had already seen something he couldn't explain. Ethan asked him what he meant, but the old man shook his head violently, clutching his coat like he was trying to hold himself together, whispering again, "You won't come back." The train roared into the station then, brakes screeching loudly as sparks flew from the tracks. But the strangest thing was that only one car had lights on, while the rest of the train behind it was completely dark, almost swallowed by shadows so deep Ethan couldn't see anything inside the windows. The lit car stopped right in front of him, its doors sliding open with an unnaturally slow hiss, and Ethan felt a cold draft brush past him like something inside the car was exhaling. He hesitated. The old man kept whispering frantically, repeating the same words, "Don't get on." But Ethan was tired, soaked from the rain, and desperate to get home, so he took a careful step toward the open doors and peeked inside. The car was completely empty. No passengers, no conductor. Not even the usual hum of ventilation. Just a long, silent, brightly lit cabin waiting for him like a trap disguised as something harmless. He stepped inside anyway. The doors slammed shut behind him instantly with such force that he flinched, and the train lurched forward before he even had time to grab a seat. The lights flickered, and suddenly the car looked different, longer somehow, as if the perspective had stretched, making the far end of the car fade into a foggy, shifting blur. He tried to look out the windows, but the tunnel outside wasn't moving the way it should. The darkness twisted and warped like thick black fog pushing against the glass from the outside. Halfway down the car, Ethan saw someone sitting in one of the seats. A woman. She sat completely still, her long hair covering her face, hands resting on her lap, her head slightly tilted in an unnatural angle, and Ethan could swear she hadn't been there when he first boarded. He called out to her cautiously, asking if she was okay or needed help, but she didn't move at all, not even to breathe. And something about the rigid posture made him take a step back, Then the lights flickered again, and now she was closer, only 3 rows away. He hadn't seen her move, hadn't heard anything. But there she was, head still bowed but body now angled halfway toward him, like something had rotated her by degrees without sound or effort. Ethan backed up slowly, gripping one of the poles tightly, heart pounding as the lights flickered again, and the woman was suddenly standing, just facing him, her hair still covering her face. The train sped up, rattling violently as the floor shook beneath him, and Ethan felt the air in the cabin grow colder and heavier, like pressure building before a storm. The woman lifted her head slowly, and though her hair still concealed her eyes, Ethan could see her mouth, stretched into a wide, quivering smile that didn't look human at all. Her voice came out like a breath through cracked wood as she whispered, "You shouldn't have gotten on." The train screeched as if hitting a sudden curve, the lights flashing chaotic pulses of white and darkness. And in the brief flashes, Ethan saw her appear in different positions. Closer, then right in front of him. He stumbled backward, slamming into the doors at the far end of the car, pushing against them desperately. But they wouldn't open, not even when he pried his fingers into the cracks and pulled with everything he had. The woman leaned in so close he could hear her teeth clicking together as she whispered, "You were chosen." The lights went out completely. The train screamed through the tunnels with no sign of stopping, and Ethan's screams vanished beneath the grinding of metal and the cold laughter that followed him into the dark. The next morning, the Red Line station reopened as normal. The old man was still sitting on the bench, but now he wasn't alone. Ethan was sitting beside him, head bowed, motionless. And when the next passenger tried to speak to him, Ethan slowly lifted his head, revealing empty, hollow eyes that reflected the tunnel behind them, where a single train car waited with its doors open. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Late one winter night, Elena was returning home on the last train of the evening, exhausted after working overtime. She entered the subway station half asleep, noticing how unusually quiet the platform was, with only the hum of old fluorescent lights echoing through the empty tunnels. She checked the digital display overhead, which showed the next train arriving in 11 minutes, so she sat down, pulled out her phone, and tried to stay awake. Only 2 other people were on the platform, an elderly man in a brown coat standing motionless near the yellow line, and a woman dressed in all black, sitting at the far end of the benches with her face hidden by a hood. A few minutes passed when suddenly, the air changed. A cold rush of wind blew through the station, much stronger than anything she had experienced before a train arrival. The old fluorescent lights flickered rapidly, like they were struggling to stay alive. Elena looked up at the arrival screen, and her stomach dropped when she saw the timer had vanished and replaced with a single message: "Incoming train, not in service." But the speakers never announced it. The station stayed quiet as the wind grew stronger, almost pulling at her coat. The tracks began to vibrate. She leaned forward, expecting to see the familiar headlights appear in the tunnel, but instead, she saw something that made her heart race. 2 dim red lights floating in the darkness, not white like a normal subway train, but a deep, unsettling red. The train emerged slowly, its exterior old, rusted, and covered in grime like it had been abandoned decades ago. The windows were fogged, cracked, and too dark to see inside. The train made no normal sound as it stopped in front of her. No screeching, no engine noise, just a low vibrating hum that felt more like it was coming from the walls of the station than the train itself. The doors opened, but no announcement played, no lights turned on inside. It was just an open black doorway that looked more like the entrance to a cave than a train car. The elderly man stepped forward suddenly without hesitation, as if pulled by something. Elena reached out instinctively and said, "Sir, wait." But he didn't even look at her. He walked inside and disappeared into the pitch-black interior, and the doors remained open. Elena turned toward the woman in black. "Should we call someone?" Elena asked. The woman lifted her head just slightly and whispered, "Don't get on. It's not supposed to be here." Before Elena could ask anything, the woman stood up and walked quickly toward the stairs leading out of the station without looking back. A sudden chill crawled down Elena's spine. Something told her to leave too. She grabbed her bag and headed toward the stairs, but just as she did, a sound rose behind her. Soft, rhythmic tapping. She turned around slowly, and her blood froze. Someone was tapping on the inside of the train window. Not with a finger, but with something sharp, leaving long scratches across the glass. The tapping became quicker and more frantic. Elena backed away, nearly tripping on the stairs. She heard whispering emerging from the train, not from one voice, but from many, overlapping and distorted, impossible to understand. The station lights began to flicker violently, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. Then the train's headlights turned on, bright and sudden, and Elena saw the old man inside. He was standing in the aisle, staring straight at her, his eyes wide and lifeless, and his mouth stretched open as if screaming, but no sound came out. Behind him, several shadowy figures moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs twisted, their heads tilted at strange angles. They were crawling toward him, and then toward the door. Elena ran up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might collapse. As she reached the upper level, the ground shook. The train let out a deafening metallic shriek and sped away without closing its doors, vanishing down the tunnel faster than any normal train could physically move. When Elena reached the street level, the entire station lights below flickered off and everything went silent. The next morning, she checked the transit app. No train had been scheduled at that time. No delays, no non-service trains. Nothing unusual. She contacted the station manager and asked if a red-lighted train had come through the previous night, but he just stared at her with confusion and said, "That line hasn't used those old models in over 30 years." As she left the station, he called after her. "Also, the cameras didn't record anyone else down there with you." But Elena remembered them clearly, the woman in black, the old man stepping inside, the figures moving in the train. She tries not to think about them, but sometimes, late at night when she walks past a tunnel entrance, she hears that same faint tapping echoing from somewhere deep underground. And she knows the train is still running, just not for the living. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. There was an old rumor among late-night subway workers that somewhere around 2:45 a.m., between two maintenance zones, a train passed through the system even though no train was scheduled, no operator had signed in, and no station cameras ever picked up its arrival, and most employees treated the story like urban legend until Natalie saw it for herself after working the last shift of the night. She was heading home, exhausted, walking down the dim underground corridor that led to the staff platform when she heard the distant, echoing rumble of an approaching train, which immediately struck her as strange because she knew with absolute certainty that all passenger service had already stopped and the tracks were supposed to be empty. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform as the sound grew louder and louder, vibrating through the concrete floor in a way that felt wrong, too heavy, too uneven, like something was dragging behind the train. The tunnel lights flickered once, then again, and a cold pressure filled the air as an old silver subway train emerged from the tunnel, moving slowly, silently, and without any official route lights showing. Natalie backed up instinctively as the train rolled past her. Every carriage was dimly lit with a sickly green glow, and the windows were fogged from the inside, but she could still make out silhouettes. Rows of passengers sitting unnaturally straight, all facing forward, none of them moving at all. She tried to look more closely into one of the windows, and as the condensation shifted, she saw the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass, not breathing, not blinking, not reacting to her presence. And she realized with a cold, sinking feeling that the figure wasn't alive. The train continued crawling along the platform, and she walked beside it, unable to look away from the windows filled with motionless passengers who all seemed frozen mid-commute, their clothes outdated by decades, their posture rigid, and their eyes hollow. The further the train moved, the colder the platform became until her breath turned white. That was when she noticed something terrifying about the passengers. In every carriage, in every single seat, every head slowly began turning toward her as if pulled by an invisible thread, their necks twisting one by one in a ripple of awful synchronization. Her stomach tightened. She stepped back from the train as the last carriage came into view, and inside this final car, instead of rows of seats, she saw a single dimly lit interior with a long aisle and no passengers, only a single figure standing in the center of the aisle. The figure was pale, impossibly tall, wearing what looked like an old subway conductor's uniform from the 1950s. He slowly raised his hand and pointed directly at her through the window. The train gave a sudden metallic screech and stopped. The doors hissed and began to open. Without thinking, Natalie ran, sprinting down the platform as the cold air behind her thickened, carrying the slow, heavy footsteps of something stepping off the train. She didn't turn around. She didn't want to see what was following her. She just kept running until she reached the maintenance door, slammed it shut, locked it, and pressed her back against it, her whole body shaking. But the horror didn't end there, because later that night, while reviewing security footage from the platform, she discovered that the cameras showed nothing. No train, no lights, no movement. Except for one thing. In the far corner of the frame, near the maintenance door she had locked, there was a shadow. A tall shadow. A shadow wearing a conductor's hat. And the shadow wasn't standing still. It was tapping on the door. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. There is a subway line in the city that most people forget even exists. An old extension built decades ago and officially shut down after structural problems. But the tunnels beneath it were never fully sealed, and trains still pass above them every night. And if you ride the last train toward the end of the line, you can sometimes hear something knocking up from beneath the floor of the carriage, as if something is moving through the forgotten level below. Elias was a night shift cleaner for the transit authority, and his job was simple. Ride the final train to the end of the route, make sure every passenger was out, and then walk the length of the platform before locking up. But on Halloween night the schedule changed, and he was instructed to check a part of the station that hadn't been inspected in years. The maintenance stairwell that led down to the sealed lower tunnels. When he reached the last station, the train was empty. The lights flickered heavily, and the usual hum of the rails felt strangely diminished, almost as if the power had been lowered, and the entire station felt colder than usual. So cold his breath came out in clouds even though the heaters were supposedly running. Elias walked toward the maintenance door, a thick gray door with peeling yellow paint that warned authorized personnel only, and as he pulled it open, he noticed the lights inside the stairwell were barely functioning, only one flickering bulb casting long shadows down the narrow descent. and for a moment he thought he saw something move on the landing below. A quick, pale shape sliding out of sight like someone ducking behind the corner. He called out, expecting maybe a vagrant or another worker, but the stairwell remained absolutely silent. And when he stepped onto the first step, he felt a vibration under his boots, a faint rhythmic thumping rising through the metal stairs, almost like footsteps far below him walking in perfect sync with his own heartbeat. The lower he descended, the colder the air became and the more the shadows seemed to shift ahead of him, until he reached the bottom landing where a second door stood half open, revealing a huge maintenance corridor lined with pipes and cables, stretching so far into darkness that his flashlight barely touched the far end. Elias stepped inside and immediately froze because the ground was covered in dust so thick it looked like ash, yet a line of fresh footprints cut straight through it. Barefoot footprints, leading deeper into the tunnel, and even stranger was the fact that the prints looked small, as if they belonged to a child, but spaced far apart as if the child had been taking unnaturally long strides. The deeper he followed them, the more wrong the tunnel felt. The hum of electricity overhead faded completely, replaced by an uneven scraping sound echoing from somewhere ahead. A dragging rhythm like someone walking with one foot sliding behind them. And each time Elias stopped, the scraping sound stopped too, as if whoever or whatever was making it did not want him to catch up. When he reached the end of the footprints, he found a rusted service hatch on the wall, slightly ajar, and a patch of black dampness beneath it that looked disturbingly like old dried blood. When he knelt to inspect it, the hatch suddenly slammed shut from the inside hard enough to echo through the entire corridor and blow dust into his face. Elias stumbled backward, heart racing, and that's when the lights above him all flickered off simultaneously, plunging the tunnel into absolute darkness except for the faint glow of his flashlight beam, which shook wildly in his trembling hand. A slow tapping sound began behind him, the same rhythm he'd heard under the station earlier, and when he turned the beam toward the sound, he saw the shadows ripple just beyond the light's reach. Not in a natural way, but in an undulating pattern like something crawling along the ceiling, and he heard a whisper drift across the tunnel. A childlike whisper. A voice so soft it could have been in his head saying, "You shouldn't be down here." He turned and ran toward the stairs, but as he did, the pipeline overhead groaned loudly, metal twisting as if something heavy was moving across it, following him, keeping pace with impossible speed, scraping, whispering, matching every desperate step he took. When he finally reached the stairwell, the door above slammed shut as if pulled by invisible hands, and the stairway lights died completely, leaving the only illumination, his flickering flashlight, which now revealed faint handprints smearing down the walls, dozens of them, small, elongated, almost claw-like, as if many children had once climbed these stairs and never made it out. He burst through the upper door at last and collapsed on the platform, trembling, gasping, trying to understand what he had seen. But the station around him was wrong, deadly silent. Every advertisement screen displaying static, every security camera tilted downward, and the train he had arrived on was no longer empty, but filled with fog swirling just behind its windows. Elias backed away slowly, and that's when he noticed something written on the dusty glass of the first carriage door, written by a small hand dragged across the condensation in long, uneven strokes. "We're still down here." The fog shifted inside the train as if something massive was moving through it, coming closer to the door, and Elias ran up the stairs and out of the station, never returning to his job again. The transit authority closed the entire line the next morning, citing electrical issues, but workers whisper that some nights, especially late, the footage from the abandoned station still shows dust blowing across the platform, even though no trains run there anymore, and faint childlike handprints appear on the security screens before the feed cuts to black. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It was almost midnight when Nina rushed down the subway stairs, her breath visible in the cold air because the city had dropped below freezing, and she didn't want to miss the last train home. She worked late shifts at a hospital, and tonight had been exhausting, so all she wanted was warmth and her bed. The station was quiet, too quiet for a city that never truly slept, and only the soft hum of the fluorescent lights echoed across the empty platform as she hugged her coat tighter around her shoulders. When the train finally arrived, the doors slid open with a slow hiss, and she stepped inside expecting to see at least one or two passengers. But the entire carriage was empty from end to end, the seats clean, the lights dimmer than usual, and there was a strange coldness in the air that made her hesitate for a moment. She reminded herself that it was late, people were home, and emptiness was normal at this hour, so she chose a seat in the middle of the car. The train began moving almost immediately, but the speed felt strange, too smooth, too fast. Almost like the train wasn't stopping at the usual stations because the landscape outside the windows blurred into darkness, as if the tunnel had no lights, no signs, no infrastructure at all. Nina pulled out her phone to distract herself, but there was no service, not even a flicker of signal, and the battery icon, which had shown 80% minutes ago, suddenly dropped to 5% before the screen shut off entirely, as if something around her had drained it. She looked up, and that's when she noticed something unbelievably unsettling. Even though the train was empty, she could hear breathing. Slow, steady, heavy breathing, coming from the far end of the carriage, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone sitting very still, someone watching. She leaned slightly to the side to look down the aisle, expecting to see a person, but the far end of the train remained empty, although the sound of breathing continued and grew louder, filling the space like the echo of someone sitting right behind her, even though the seat was clearly empty. Nina forced herself to look forward again, trying to stay calm, but the overhead lights flickered for a moment and the train suddenly slowed down, then stopped completely in the middle of a pitch-black tunnel that didn't resemble any stretch she'd ever seen on this line. The doors opened by themselves, revealing only darkness outside, and a cold draft rushed into the car, brushing past her as if something invisible had walked in. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air inside the train thickened around her, making it difficult to inhale. Then, from the open doorway at the far end of the car, a figure stepped inside. It wasn't a person. Not completely. Its limbs looked stretched, its posture wrong, and its face was covered by someone else's face, like a mask made of real skin flattened onto its head. It stood perfectly still, one hand gripping the metal pole, its covered face pointed directly at Nina as the train's lights dimmed again, leaving her in a dim orange glow that made the creature's silhouette look taller, sharper, more distorted. The doors closed behind it. The train began moving again, faster this time, almost violently fast. And the creature began walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps, the kind of slow that meant it wasn't in a hurry, because it knew she had nowhere to go. Every step it took making the poles tremble slightly as if the metal recognized something unnatural touching it. Nina stood up and ran toward the next carriage, slamming her shoulder into the door, but it wouldn't open. She looked back and saw the figure halfway down the aisle, its head tilted unnaturally far to the side as if studying her, and she screamed for help even though she knew no one could hear her because the train wasn't stopping, wasn't slowing, wasn't following any route she recognized. Desperate, she turned and kicked the emergency door release. This time it opened. The cold tunnel wind blasted in as she stumbled into the next carriage, which was also empty. But before the door fully closed behind her, she saw the creature's hand slide around the metal edge of the door, long fingers curling inward like they were stretching and searching for her. She kept running, moving from car to car, but every carriage was identical and empty and endless, as if the train had become an infinite loop of repeating cars, each one colder and darker than the last. Eventually, she reached a carriage that wasn't empty. A woman sat alone in the center seat, wearing an outdated dress, her hair neatly combed, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look up. Nina gasped with relief and ran toward her, asking for help, asking if she could hear her. But the woman didn't move, not even a blink. And when Nina reached out to touch her shoulder, the woman's head rolled slowly to the side. She had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly where her features should have been. Nina stumbled back in horror, and the train suddenly lurched, throwing her to the ground just as the lights flickered again, revealing dozens of faceless passengers now sitting in the seats behind her, all turned toward her, all breathing in a slow, synchronized pattern that made the air vibrate. Then she heard the creature entering the carriage behind her. Its footsteps were careful, patient, confident. The faceless passengers rose from their seats as one, turning their blank faces toward Nina while the creature reached for her. And as the train roared faster and faster into the darkness, the last thing Nina saw before everything collapsed into black was her own reflection in the window. Except her face was missing too. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your night with us. If these stories gave you chills, there's plenty more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe to NightFear Stories for new terrifying tales every single night. Sleep well, if you can.